Hello, everyone. My name is Serena Gibbon. I head up Tenancy Advisory Limited, which is an independent advisory practice specializing in residential tenancy law. We work with landlords, property managers, and government agencies, helping them navigate the rental sector in plain English. Personally, I hold a Bachelor and Master of Law from the University of Auckland. I'm also enrolled with the High Court of New Zealand as a barrister and solicitor, and have spent the last 17 years in the residential tenancy sector. I'd imagine most prominently as the general manager of the Auckland Property Investors Association. That's where a lot of people in the industry know me from. So today I am going to be talking about embedding privacy principles into your everyday property management practices. And just before I kick off, I just want to remind everybody that my presentation is intended as general guidance only and not legal tax or financial advice. And ultimately, my role here is to really help shift your thinking about privacy compliance. So in terms of questions, I will do my best to leave some time at the end of the session to field some questions. So please do feel free to pop them in the Q&A box. I will come to them once I've gone through the whole thing. So let's kick it off. I've got my slide on the page here for you. So the starting point when I think about privacy is really that there is, in terms of how we appreciate personal information, I see a massive asymmetry of importance from service providers and clients. Okay, so there's definitely a double standard when it comes to data care. We tend to, as individuals, I find, guard our own data like dishes. We're right into the two-factor authentication. We're never going to give a stranger our credit card details over the phone. We use things like incognito tabs on Google Chrome and Apple Pay. But to the extent where you'd think that you are guarding your personal information like it is state secrets. But the second we're handling someone else's data, we sort of treat it a little bit like admin clutter. And when we're thinking as property managers and landlords about the privacy rules to do with the rental sector, we treat it as the compliance burden. Because, think about it. When's the last time you casually mentioned a problem tenant to another landlord or a property manager or your colleague in your own firm at a networking event? Okay. When's the last time you emailed a full tenancy file, forwarded a full tenancy file to a contractor without thinking twice? So, and this is the thing, this is the kicker. We're not talking about tenants, just tenants. If you are a property manager, your landlords are your clients as well, and they have rights and expectations under the Privacy Act. So in putting together this presentation, I sort of don't want it to be about specific rules, because ultimately the Privacy Act we have is framed out with 13 information privacy principles. So it's a very principle-based piece of legislation. So I really want to be talking about principles or dynamics. Your clients aren't, ultimately, they're not scrolling through the Privacy Act looking for breaches that you've committed. Fundamentally, they care about their dignity. And when data is treated carelessly, dignity gets shredded and you lose a massive amount of trust with your management business. So understand this, your client's personal information is arguably your most valuable asset after the property itself. And this is the thing, is bad actors know it. Okay, like the hackers out there, they don't care about the rent roll. They don't care about, they don't care so much about access to the bank accounts, because that's a different type of hacking. But they want to get the passport information or the personal information from your Dropbox account. Okay, and if you are not securely encrypting or making sure that your password is a super secure one, or you're not using a data platform that is encrypting these information and storing them, locking them down, absolutely, and continuously investing in data security, then you will very likely be in a position where the data would land in the hand of bad actors, and they're incredibly valuable on the black market. Something to be really aware of when you're in the business of tenancy management is that we are in what I call a trust recession at the moment. The rental sector is shifting. Properties are sitting vacant for longer, and there is definitely an oversupply in certain topographies of properties in certain suburbs. And that means one thing is that tenants now have more choice. So they're not just looking for the property at the right location with the right price point, with the right layout. They're also asking themselves, who am I going to be dealing with for the next 12 months, 24 months, or even 5 years? Okay. And in a trust recession, respect for privacy becomes a competitive edge for business providers. It's not a tick box exercise, it's actually your reputation. And I think this is particularly so if you are a manager from a big brand firm, or if you're a landlord, self-managing landlord with a significant number of properties you are looking after, because your reputation would more likely than not carry a massive amount of weight. Think about what I call the front page of the Herald test. How much goodwill are you going to lose if your name hits the headlines for mishandling tenants' information? And also go further than that. Ask yourself, what does the loss of that goodwill actually translate into in terms of lost business? Okay. Now, working in the industry, especially since I believe it was 2021 when the last privacy commissioner issued some very detailed guidance for the rental sector, which is again followed up by the current commissioner, who also updated the guidance earlier this year in February. What I've observed in the industry is very much like there is a propensity for us to overfixate on the exact wordings of these guidance documents themselves. And by the way, if you haven't already seen the rental sector guidance that's issued by the OPC, it's a super helpful document, two documents, one written for landlords and property managers, the other one written for tenants. Very helpful. Go through them. It's on privacy.org.nz. You can get access to them straight away. What I've noticed is we tend to fixate on the actual wordings of the guidance and kind of lose sight of the fact that fundamentally the law is the Privacy Act. The guidance is your best practice suggestion from the OPC. Okay, so the law lies in the information privacy principles, all 13 of them under the Act. The OPC guidance is exactly what it is. It's guidance. It helps you comply, but it's not what you are required to comply with. Okay, so for example, one of the most, I want to say, most controversial aspects of the landlord's guidance is that the OPC takes very much what I call a phased approach to information collection. It anticipates or describes a scenario where you collect a tiny amount of information at the time you organize open homes and get people to sign up for open homes. So you just collect their names and their contact details. You then collect a little bit more when it comes to the first stage of the application process. And then when it comes to shortlisting and making your final decision, you're in a position to collect a bit more than that. And that includes things like disclosure waiver for doing backgrounds and credit checks. Now, that is an approach, that's not the approach, okay? So there are definitely exceptions out of those circumstances that does not require you to take a very regimented standalone phase approach that takes the process from open home to letting out your rental property. Okay, say for example, if a prospective tenant lives out of town, is not able to attend an open home, and just wants to apply for the property sight unseen, you're quite within your rights to collect a lot more information up front because you're already at that application stage. So when you understand the principles, because you're make sure you understand the principle, because if you don't, you're just copying the guidance and you're just outsourcing good judgment. And this is the thing about successful businesses, is that you really need to be exercising good judgment. Good judgment is absolutely everything. So on the slide in front of you, I've sort of put together, like all 13 principles are super important, but I think I've sort of mapped out 5 super relevant ones for property managers and landlords to be aware of. They're to do with collection. So the de minimis approach, you collect as little as you need to carry out your lawful purpose, always making sure that there's a through line between the information you're collecting and the reason behind it. Now, the reason can't just be it is for your peace of mind, or it is a just in case kind of approach. The question to ask yourself is, would a disinterested and reasonable third bystander in your position collect that same information in order to carry out the lawful purpose that he or she is carrying out? Again, in your case, as a property manager or a landlord, it is the process of renting out a property, finding the best tenant on merit, and looking after that property from the start till the end. IPP3, making sure that you are very transparent with your tenant in terms of what you're collecting, how you're collecting it. You need to be careful about storage and security. You need to have a retention strategy, and you also need to disclose very clearly to tenants about what you're collecting. Here's the quick privacy to profit pipeline. If you have any doubts as to why privacy should matter from a profit point of view. So really one thing I want to encourage everyone to think about is privacy is not a cost center. Okay, don't think of it as a checklist of compliance. That's just another additional pain in the ass thing you're going to have to do because you happen to be in the business of tenancy management. Think of it as a profit lever, because such a big proportion of this industry, in my experience, is taking privacy compliance as a bit of an afterthought. When when people become property managers, what is front and foremost in their mind is compliance to the Residential Tenancies Act and things like healthy home standards, the healthy home regulations. Okay, you don't think sort of privacy is a bit like a checkbox they have to go through, but I just think, I think in a increasingly competitive market where tenants are reclaiming some of that power out of the previous imbalance that just persisted in our market because of the chronic housing shortage that we've had in New Zealand. Tenants are flipping the script a little bit, and I am seeing, when I interact with tenant groups, I am seeing more and more of them taking the bold step of background checking their prospective landlords or property managers. And this, this aspect about the trust recession we're talking about, people being super careful with their personal information, and they want to see business providers being as careful, if not more so, with their personal information, would really feed into ultimately your profit, your bottom line. Okay, so when you embed a privacy first practice into your business, this is what would happen. You reduce legal risks. You reduce also everyday hassles of potential disputes and all those grumblings from tenants day to day that, so many of us know how much time and resources those grumblings, like before they even go to a tenancy tribunal or go to a complaint with the investigators at the OPC, how much resource it sucks up, how much emotional toll it sort of places on you. So definitely, I think there's a huge business advantage to minimizing your legal risk. You avoid the disputes or OPC assessments. You're signaling to the market that you are a professional who is worth renting from. And I think this is really significant, especially given that the property management industry still remains to be unregulated. Now, that's going to change in the near future. But for the time being, it is still very much a bit of a wild, wild west out there. And I see definitely businesses doing all sorts of different things to clearly help themselves stand out from the competition. Ultimately, I think having a privacy first approach would also net you better quality tenants, fewer headaches, and therefore stronger returns. When you act professional, when you act in a way that supports your tenant's ability or your client, your landlord's ability to trust your brand, you can really benefit from that trust being converted into business currency. Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the concept of data governance. Now, look, I'm not a data scientist, but I do have the privilege to be on the periphery of a community of data scientists. So these are, without sort of going into the nitty-gritty type of it, I sort of just want to transport transport some of those fundamental principles to do with data governance, and overlay them with how we are operationalizing privacy in our business. When I talk about data governance in this context, it is really a fancy way of saying you need to have a clear strategy and framework to collect, store, use, share, and delete your client's information. And you need to go through all of these steps with the appropriate seriousness and deliberateness. Okay, it's how you move privacy from policy to practice. So a few things to map out when it comes to the information privacy principles to data governance. I'm front of mind, I'm thinking about principle one, which is the purpose of collection. You must only collect what you need and nothing more. Principle five, to do with safeguards, lock down those files. Okay, it's not, so often when I advise property managers who, especially those ones who are one-man bands, there's so many of them out there, who work out of a home office, use a home computer that their family members can log into as well. And I sort of raise that it is not the best practice, perhaps. So many times the pushback is, oh, but my wife or my husband or my children, they can be trusted, And I think it's really important, guys, to get out of that mindset of it is not, depersonalize the issue. It is not about the people who are immediately around you, who are exposed to that information and what they can do with it. When you're thinking about putting together best practice principles, depersonalize the whole process and just focus on the issue. Okay, it's not about the people in your immediate vicinity, whether they can be trusted, even if they happen to see your tenant's personal information, that you can trust them to not share it, that like the circle of trust ends with them kind of concept. I don't think it's super helpful, and I think it misses the point about data governance. Okay, so make sure you have adequate safeguards, and whatever device and whatever hardware you're using, whatever software you're using, lock down those damn files. Okay, I'm thinking about principle 9 to do with retain. Retain what you require, what you're especially lawfully required to retain. Delete what you don't need as soon as possible, and delete properly. Finally, disclosure, share with third parties only what is relevant. And again, always be prepared to share the information back with your tenants or your landlord clients. A good sort of rule of thumb that I use when I think about the way I handle information in my various sort of business undertakings is, if the person who owns that information, so if the landlord or the tenant who owns that information comes to you and say, hey, I want you to tell me exactly every piece of information you hold of me, are you going to cringe? Are you going to have a super uncomfortable moment? And are you going to start thinking about, oh my God, how do I backtrack out of some of these information that I'm still retaining, but I'm retaining in a way that's inappropriate and possibly unlawful under the Privacy Act? Be mindful as well, for those of you who are working with staff members and contractors, a lot of the risks with your management business comes from the invisible hands of your staff, your contractors, and your formal property managers or staff members. Okay. There's not nearly enough privacy training within management companies, based on my experience. Definitely, because as business owners, you can't be there 24/7 watching hawkishly how everybody is treating your client's information. Okay, so I think the starting point is making sure that you treat privacy knowledge as equally important as tenancy RTA knowledge. Okay, data governance, having a good data governance strategy shines a light on all of that. Good governance leads to predictability. Predictability breeds professionalism, and professionalism builds trust. And like I said before, trust, I believe, ultimately leads to a profitable business model. I want to talk about, some of the things that we casually do as business owners or property managers or landlords that we think is pretty harmless, and that we've been doing it, we've been doing these little acts for years and years and years. So why should we change the way we sort of run our business? I think some of the stuff I do think is important to highlight here, because they are breaches of, technically, many of them are actually breaches of the Privacy Act, in my opinion. I think also in the last, especially since the 2021 guidance came out, I think in the last 5-6 years, all the rhetoric, the public discourse we've had about privacy in the rental sector focus, probably quite rightly so, focus heavily on collection. And I think that is in part a response to the persistent imbalance of power between landlords and tenants inability to get into rental housings because of the chronic shortage that we've had in our housing market. But overall, when I take a step back and look at all the principles under the Privacy Act, collection is just one side of the data lifecycle. There's also lots of good practices to put in when it comes to retention, security, storage, deletion, disclosure, all that sort of stuff. So I just want to cover, I've sort of mapped out a few on the screen in front of you. I want to highlight a few things here for you guys to think about, because some of these things we do, it feels like admin. And it feels pretty harmless, but there are actually some, I think, technically breaches or just not super great practices that could potentially put you and your business at risk. Okay. I think things like the propensity to share Dropbox or Google folders with external parties with no password could be problematic. Having weak passwords and not having like a hygienic password practice, like not regularly changing your passwords and having the right combination. Or I personally really like using random password generators to generate truly random passwords, because every time I come up with a password myself, it's always has just something to do with my birth date or my first pet and all that sort of stuff. I just can't ever seem to put anything ingenious. So I just rely on a random password generator personally. I think about things like, how often do you guys, we all have smartphones. How often does your smartphone password app tells you that your stored password for a particular website has come up, has been picked up in a data breach, and that you're required to change your password? How many of us ignore that message? I know I certainly do a lot of the times, and that's definitely not practice. Forwarding tenants' information to contractors just in case, especially without tenants' knowledge or consent. I don't think that's okay. Back in the days when, before 2021, the media would definitely seem to suggest that there's a rampant practice of bad tenant lists floating around landlord circles. I don't think that was ever true. But one bad tenant list is one too many, in my opinion. So I don't have a problem with that kind of reporting. Bad tenant lists, they don't really exist so much these days, at least not that I know of. But there's still sharing of bad tenant information that's very casual and very problematic. I'll give you guys an example. I mentioned at the top of the session that I run the Auckland Property Investors Association. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the organization, it is basically a non-profit for property investors and residential landlords. It is not uncommon still in 2025 for us to get probably once or twice a month for our office to be getting an email or a contact us form submission from someone we have no knowledge of, so presumably a property manager or a landlord, with the name and last known address of a tenant, who they deem to be bad. And they send it to us in hope that we would then circulate it with among our members. I want to be really, really clear. If you are one of those property managers who do something like that and have sent us those information, those emails, those messages get deleted from our system straight away. The moment we get it, respond to it, we don't use that information. We just delete it. We don't want it. We don't want to know. But the fact that we do receive it, I can't help but turn my mind to how many other organizations like ours are also getting that information, and how are they treating it. I think is could be risky. Um, Rejected applicants. If you are holding on to rejected applicants' information for way too long, that's very problematic, especially without their knowledge. I know some property management companies have a practice of retaining the information of rejected applicants in the hope that in future they can be matched up with another tenancy. If you do that, definitely get the project tenant's consent. Be aware as well, the RTA has a requirement for you to hold on to certain communications between yourself and rejected tenant applicants for 12 months after the tenancy had expired, the concerned tenancy, despite the applicant themselves not ever partaking in that tenancy itself. It's a little bit strange, but just you're required to hold that information for 12 months. But as much as possible, if it is not important, not relevant to any lawful purpose, delete that information. I see a lot of tenant application forms. People are very good at doing the privacy waiver, so that tenant consent to having credit checks and background checks carried out for them, but don't see a lot of privacy statements on those applications or indeed tenancy agreements. And when I say privacy statements, it's it's a clear. It doesn't have to be super complicated. I think the Privacy Commissioner's Office, the website, offers a statement builder that you can sort of put together yourself and send it to your lawyer to check out. But basically a clear, concise statement that is to do with what information you're holding of your tenants, how you're going to use that information, who you're going to share that information with, and your tenant's ability to ask for the information back to him or her, and the ability to correct that information if it is indeed incorrect. Another emerging trend in the property management circle is one of those 360-degree cameras. So rather than doing an inspection by physically attending the property and looking, sort of going through every room meticulously, some property managers are starting to put in those rotating 360 cameras that just capture an image of a 360 image of the whole space. Be really careful with those, and that making sure that you are not inadvertently collecting personally identifiable information that belongs to your tenant that is outside of your role as a property manager, i.e. that you cannot link to a lawful purpose to. Auto syncing, being on cloud access, shared devices. I mentioned a little bit before about running your management business on a shared computer that your whole family has access to, or auto syncing between your phone and cloud accounts and family cloud account, all that sort of stuff. Have a think about what does that look like in terms of your how hygienic your privacy approach is to your business. I do think a lot of these little habits that I've picked up on, like I mentioned, has little to do with the collection side of things. And this is a particular decision because I do reference the 2022 OPC study that was done in conjunction with Consumer New Zealand. So that was about a year after the privacy guidance came out in 21. And that study actually showed that most property managers and landlords were getting the collection side of things right. So to me, like the real blind spots that exist in the industry is very much disclosure, storage, retention, and disposal. And some of these things that you see on the page in front of you are just some bad habits that I would really encourage you to break if you do indeed have them. Now let's talk a little bit about moving theories to practice. So bearing in mind your privacy principles, they're abstract in nature. So there's not like clear black and white rules of you must do this, you must do that. Okay, bearing in mind the guidance is a best practice suggestion from the OPSA. Fundamentally, you're required to comply to the Act itself. And also bearing in mind too, when it comes to optimizing your business outcome, compliance is one thing, but fundamentally the profitability is in sustained tenancy of with good quality tenants and good quality tenants and good quality landlord clients. They care about their dignity, okay? And their personal information, the way you handle that personal information goes hand in hand with their sense of dignity when they deal with you. I'm thinking about collecting only what is necessary, getting information directly from source, so you're not scraping information off the internet of people, making your tenants be friends with you on Facebook so you can look at their socials. Don't do anything like that. Tell people what you're collecting, what information of theirs that you're collecting, and why you're collecting it. Use secure systems. Be very careful with the cloud technology and auto syncing. Always be prepared to give your clients access to their data if they ask, and be prepared to correct the errors without any delay. Delete what you don't need. There are some laws requiring you to hold information. I'm going to cover them shortly, but don't have those dead weight of unnecessary redundant information in your system. It's not in your interest. And in terms of the way cloud storage costs are going, you're just cutting into your bottom line. Share only what is absolutely necessary with third parties, especially more and more property managers I see are going on to those sort of having access to like collective dashboards with service providers like healthy home providers or healthy home inspection providers or maintenance and repair contractors, where there are more computer systems now where the landlords and the tenants and property manager all have access to their own dashboard and get real-time information on where the repair job is at or healthy home compliance is at, that sort of stuff. If you are engaging in those platforms, just make sure that you due diligence and finding out from the platform providers what safeguards they have put into, so that the right logins got the access to the information, and that especially in the case of third-party contractors, that they're not able to backdoor their way into accessing information that they do not need, that has nothing to do with the services they've been engaged to carry out, but is nevertheless information you retain of your tenant or your landlords. So just remember that, compliance is not performative. It actually has to be done by design, and it has to be built into your everyday management practice. Now, what's my next thing? Oh, okay. You only get one chance to make, well, not one chance, maybe not, but you only get to make one impression. So clients don't have different avatars of you. Okay, they don't think that in their mind, they don't sort of distinguish you into different characters. They just have one avatar in their mind of you. You're not one person when managing rent arrears and another person when you're handling people's personal information. It's all the same leadership. You're one character. And if your privacy practices are sloppy, people just assume you are sloppy all the way throughout to your management practice. And that means they would automatically assume that you cut corners, you cannot be trusted, and they will start, for those people who are that way inclined, they would start questioning your motivation and intention behind every single thing you do, and they will start resisting or not cooperating with you. And for those of you out there who have been managing tenancies for a very long time, you know that the real time suck with property management is dealing with these knucklehead back and forth resistance, redundant resistance from a tenant, simply because they just assume you are coming from a place of bad intention. Okay, so if you're professional, you're upfront, you're trustworthy with people's personal information, you set the tone of the relationship. Just remember in business, your X factor isn't having the cheapest rental, isn't having the cheapest management fee. It's how people feel when they deal with you. Do you make your clients feel good? And if you build your privacy practice orientated around trust and respect, that's not just about complying with the Privacy Act or mirroring that of the privacy guidance, you will win friends and you will win because you will make your tenants feel and your landlords feel valued, feel dignified, and they just feel good dealing with you. And that would make them not want to find a different property or not want to move from property managers to property managers just to save 1% or 1.5% on management fees. Okay. Some suggestions I have to help you lift up your privacy game. You don't need, first thing I would say here is you don't need to make a huge amount of change in your business. We're talking about simple tweaks. We're not talking having like a full-on tech stack or privacy policy library to get this right. I think that's just boiling the ocean for things that's really easy to create and fix at your end. Okay, so I've mapped out a 5-step process here for you to think about after today's session. Firstly, create a data map. When I say a data map, I mean committing you and your business to a framework that outlines what data you are going to collect, when you're going to collect it, how you're going to collect it, where is that information going to live, and who touches it at different points in time. Okay. Secondly, have a retention schedule. Now, you need to retain in a way that de-risks your business, but you also need to retain in a way that abides to various laws and statutes. So some of the things that come to mind are things like you're required to retain 7 years of tax records. So some of those rent summaries you do need to hold on to for 7 years. You are required to hold on to certain tenancy information for 12 months after the tenancy had ended in case of a tenancy compliance investigations team assessment. 6 years if there is a strong likelihood you will bring a money claim against the tenant, because under the Limitations Act, you have 6 years to bring a money claim against a party. But be really careful with this. It doesn't mean you should retain everybody's information for 6 years, absolutely. But I think in exceptional cases where it is more likely than not that you would be making a claim or responding to a claim, I think it's appropriate to have that 6-year limit, consider that 6-year limit as your upper ceiling. After this year's RTA, the new RTA amendments that came in back in March, you can also retain the email address of the tenant that you had collected in the course of the tenancy, and even after, 2 years after, if that email address is not on the tenancy agreement as an address for service. And this is in particularly for the purpose of if there is any likelihood that you would be making a tenancy tribunal application against this tenant outside of that 2 years window, 2 years after the tenancy, then you will need to have that email address in order to serve the application on the tenant properly. Yeah, so those are probably front of mind when I think about what are the rules, the actual laws that exist that limit or puts a ceiling on to what extent can you hold on to information after a tenancy has expired. Third step, control access by third step is have a clear deletion policy. And when I say delete, have a think about your paper files, your soft files, how you're deleting them. If you're storing things on cloud storage, how do you delete properly? Sometimes just putting things in the recycling bin isn't quite deleting. So just make sure that whatever platform you're using, then you are fully aware and have knowledge of how to utilize all the features on that platform, so you can hand on heart be in a position to say to anyone who inquires, you have properly disposed of the information. If you are still stuck on paper forms, don't just put them in the paper recycling. People do, like, bad actors do go do like what the Americans call dumpster dive for personal information. So do shred your paper, shred, burn, whatever. Just make sure that you are deleting properly. Control access to information in a role-based fashion. Make sure that your system is set up in a way so that contractors and admin staff and different property managers within your same firm only see what is absolutely necessary and not everything under the sun. Okay. Do audit, in addition to that, make sure that you are auditing the capabilities of your storage and assessing whether or not it continues to be the most appropriate way for you to be storing these personal information that belong to your clients. Make sure your system is properly encrypted, shut down any inappropriate cloud-based access and auto-syncing functions so that bad actors cannot easily backdoor into your system. Have a clear privacy policy statement. Again, we're all very good at getting waivers to get credit and background checks, but there's just not enough privacy statements out there that clearly outlines to the tenants and your landlords how their information will be how their information will be treated in your system. So as you can see, these are all really small and deliberate steps that can really massively change the way your business is perceived by the market. Finally, just want to have some sort of the point I want to make to wrap up the session is how you handle someone else's data tells them everything they need to know about how you handle their tenancy. Your privacy habits basically is a reflection of your overall professionalism as a property manager or a landlord, especially in the case of a property manager. As the industry continues to be unregulated, this is definitely, like, every service provider just has to work extra hard to distinguish themselves from the pack. And I think privacy is an area of your business practice that you can easily make some transformative differences that would improve your bottom line. If you want to be seen as someone worth renting from, worth working with, and worth referring to, then I would suggest to you that privacy is a good starting point for you to get that going. So that's me. I've got my contact details on the page in front of you. If you would like to reach out to me with any questions. I do have a few minutes left, so I will just see if there are any questions. Okay, I've got a question here. Welcome your thoughts on reports and guidance from the OPC about landlords over collecting PI from tenants and or retaining that when they have no business need to do so. I do apologize to the person who asked this question. I just came back from like a 5-week trip away, so I'm a little mind boggled. Could you just clarify what PI is? Oh, personal information. Of course, I've only just spent the last hour talking about personal information. Sorry about that. I am back in New Zealand time, I promise you. Welcome your thoughts on reports and guidance from the OPC about landlords over collecting personal information from tenants and retaining that when they have no business need to do so. Super problematic. And I think my starting point is I don't tend to assume bad intention. My starting point is always assume that people are well intended. Because when you do that, you take the heat out of the situation and you can deal with it rationally. I think landlords and property managers had operated for so long in the New Zealand environment without much guidance and oversight from the OPC. It's only in the last 10 years, especially in the with the advent of Facebook groups, bad tenant lists that's being shared online, that sort of stuff, that really privacy had it's become a big issue in the industry. And I think, when you couple that lack of support and guidance and scrutiny with the inherent power imbalance between landlords and tenants, you end up in a scenario where some landlords or property managers feel entitled to collect that information to make a value judgment on their tenants. Because the thing is, Jeff, many times property managers and landlords, when they have a property on the market, they're faced with so many applicants. It's only in recent months that equation is shifting a little bit. But for the longest time, people are dealing, for one property, they could receive 20 or 30 applications, and they're just looking for ways to find the best tenant on merit. And in the overzealousness of doing that, that some people carry out, it can result in over collection of information. Fundamentally, I think people needs better education and schooling around drawing that through line between the information they're collecting and the lawful purpose behind it. I'm thinking back to a time where there was a property manager not that long ago who I think just said to the media or said to a government panel quite casually that she would look at tenants' bank statements, make a value judgment on what type of people the tenant is, so that if the tenant is eating that, like, is it KFC or McDonald's, that she wouldn't rent to those people. And that was just, the absurdity wasn't the position. The absurdity wasn't so much the position itself. The position was absurd. The absurdity to me was just how casual this very experienced property manager would share that sentiment so openly at that forum and expected no blowback. So yeah, what do I think? I think practices like that is a timely reminder that the industry still needs a lot of support from the likes of the OPC, from the legal profession at large, from privacy experts, to really flesh out and have a more detailed, deep, and nuanced approach to privacy compliance and respecting tenants' dignity by respecting their personal information. If guys, for those of you who are listening out there who's not interested in plugging into more support information, support or education programs, I would say, look, my general rule of thumb is ask yourself, if this tenant is asking me of this piece of information that belongs to me, this piece of personal information, would I be happy to give it? And sometimes that lands us broadly at where we should be. Do landlords respond well to the idea of protecting privacy? By and large, I would say yes, landlords respond well to the idea of protecting tenants' privacy. A lot of my personal experience, a lot of times when I talk to landlords around, hey, these little habits you have is not super great, the first response I get from people is just, they're horrified. They've never turned their mind to, they're just trying to be expedient. They're trying to, they have a contractor lined up to fix some pipes. They just forwarded a whole chain of emails to the contractor without thinking much about the tenant's information being inadvertently shared because of that forwarding. But when you raise the alarm to them, when you sort of raise it to them and flag it to them, more than not, people are horrified. They're embarrassed. They sort of, they certainly don't want to invite an OPC investigation. But I think, I think it is definitely an environment where we, as bystanders, we can take the temperature out by assuming people act with good intention, but with little knowledge and little sophistication. And approach the discussion, at least in this initial stage, with the intent to support and upskill rather than demonize them, because that, ultimately, the longer we have that supply and demand imbalance, the longer landlords and property managers are going to have power over tenants. And the way to get landlords and property managers to care about tenants' personal information, I think it's not demonizing them, it's educating them. So you want to be bringing them to the right side of the issue, so that they've bought into the overall culture we're trying to share here, which is that our personal information is just as valuable as everyone else's, and we all have a duty to take care. Are you able to share any complaints or enforcement decisions you're aware of? I'm personally aware of, I know I wouldn't be as aware as the people who are actually at OPC running the investigation function, but the last time I checked in with the team, I'm aware that there are several complaints and not many have been upheld by the OPC after appropriate assessment. I could be wrong, but that's my understanding based on my interaction with them. Great info for self-managers. Please comment on landlord-property manager relations business. I'm not quite sure what this question relates to, but I think, if I can sort of step back, I would probably comment more broadly on, if you're a professional property manager, just be mindful that so much of what we talk about in terms of privacy and best practice relates to your handling of your tenants' information. Don't forget, if you're a property manager, your clients also includes landlords, and you need to be very careful about the way you handle the landlord's information. I'll give you an example. Doing some of the work I do and being in this ecosystem, wearing different hats at different times. From time to time, there will be property managers who warn me about certain landlords, and they will tell me the landlord's name, and they will tell me, things like, certainly share enough information to the extent that I can definitely clearly identify the landlord, know some pretty private stuff about their business portfolio and their business and their personal affairs. And those are just things that I'm super, super uncomfortable with. And again, that's just another reminder to the property management industry that you don't just owe a duty of privacy to your tenants, you also owe it to your landlords. What are tenants' rights if they find their private information is being shared? Absolutely, first place to go to, guys, is to make a complaint to the OPC. The OPC has investigative power and enforcement power over the rental sector, or over everyone. So definitely that's your first protocol. One of my slides before talked about caring about their dignity, and you get to only make one impression as a property manager or a landlord, and people do talk. I don't think it's super great, but people do talk, and by that I mean, from time to time, if I just Google the names of property managers and landlords, I do see some very unsavory things shared about these landlords or property managers on the internet, like Google or Reddit. Not super great, a bit petty-ish in my opinion, but I do know that that's a channel some tenants utilize. I wouldn't use them as reference points if I'm a tenant looking for property managers or landlords to rent from, especially if I'm in a position to choose. Just because inherently those online forums are not super reliable in my opinion, but that's one avenue. It's not the best avenue, but yeah, definitely do make a complaint to the OPC. If you think it is so, another lever that I think tenants can press, and I'm probably going to get into trouble for saying this from my friends in the property management and landlord sectors, is that, I know legacy media, for example, is always interested in human interest stories in the housing sector. So not that you should laud the threat of exposing someone to the media, but I do think sometimes in egregious cases where personal information is really being denigrated and not just carelessly handled, but definitely denigrated. I do think approaching legacy media with a with a pitch might not be the worst thing, because if your personal information is being if your dignity is being trampled on in that manner, you gotta be thinking to yourself, who else is a victim of that kind of bad practice, and can we do anything to harness any sort of collective power to shine a light on those issues? And at the very least, if the law can't step in to curtail that behavior, at the very least, hurt the or disincentivize that business practice by causing some publicity risk for them. Cool. I think those are all one more question before I wrap up the hour. How do you recommend dealing with blacklists from a manager's perspective? How to do this responsible? Blacklists. Don't have blacklists. Look, I think if you're a property manager and you're trying to figure out, you're confronted with so many choices, 20, 30 tenant applicants. First of all, congratulations, you obviously have a fantastic property you're renting out and it's got lots of interest. But secondly, if I'm a property manager looking for the best tenant on merit, I wouldn't refer to a blacklist. I'll definitely run a name check through the Tenancy Tribunal database, which is a publicly available database that reports on recent tribunal decisions. I know there's grumbling in the industry around discontent around how the tribunal adjudicators are exercising their powers under Section 98 to suppress parties' details under certain criteria. But every time I looked into it, I'll be honest with you guys, more often than not, it's the landlord's details that's being suppressed and not the tenants. In my very unscientific way of conducting research, I generally see that more often than not, it's landlord's details being suppressed, not tenants. But as much as possible, there's ample information available out there in the public domain that gives you a sense, and also, gives you, not only do you want to get a sense of how often had a tenant been to a tenancy tribunal, you also want to be reading the tribunal adjudication, because just because you're a named party on the tribunal doesn't mean you're a bad property manager or a bad landlord or bad tenant, right? Like, context matters. So do look at that. Definitely do credit and background checks. Do it in a really nuanced way. I've lost count of the number of property managers who do not have a strategy when they do reference checks, when they ring previous landlords, and just kind of have wishy-washy conversations that do not end up netting them any meaningful information about the tenant. So I think there are definitely a lot of things you can do as a property manager in a lawful and appropriate way to find the best tenant on merit. I think what some landlords and property managers lose sight of sometimes is they're busy looking for someone with an absolutely spotless history, that they've gotten that life is long and complicated, and past performances is not always a guarantee of future conduct. Fundamentally, a lot of the times when tenancies go wrong, it is, in my experience, it is when someone has sustained an unexpected and shocking change in their life, and it is their ability to cope with that change and cope with that disruption. And I mean it from a landlord tenant, both landlords and tenants. It's their ability to cope with those disruptions that signal whether they in fact are the right person to be in a tenancy relationship with. And some of that stuff you can't predict, you can't check, you can't, it's hard to fathom when you're looking at, but as much as possible, you do your best to find the best tenant. Do you rely, I just, in no circumstances do I ever think it's appropriate to rely on a blacklist. And even if they're still floating around out there, none of them are validated anyway. It's a bit like, if you're a property management company, you go Google your business name. I bet you there's probably going to be a bad review about your company. However many good reviews, there's at least one bad review out there. And is that itself detrimental in signaling that no one should do business with you? I don't think so. Yeah, that's what I would say. So yeah, I'm coming up to 2:30. I hope you guys had enjoyed my little presentation today on how to embed privacy practices into your everyday management strategy. If you have any questions, my contact details are on the screen in front of you. Feel free to reach out to me, and all the best with your tenancy forward. Thank you.